Her fine dining evening takes an unexpected turn when a restaurant manager decides to single out a well-dressed black woman, humiliating her in front of other patrons. What the manager doesn't realize is that her son, who accompanies her that night, is an off-duty police officer. With tension building and biases on full display, the mother and son duo are about to deliver a lesson that will leave the entire restaurant in stunned silence. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. The first encounter. The evening at La Belle Époque was unfolding as usual. The restaurant was bustling with diners, the faint sound of classical piano weaving through the air alongside murmured conversations and the occasional clink of wine glasses. Among the sea of faces, Mary Daniels, a well-dressed black woman in her late 50s, sat alone at a table near the window. Her calm demeanor and quiet confidence blended seamlessly into the refined atmosphere, yet she couldn't help but notice the occasional side glances from other patrons. Mary adjusted her scarf, glanced at her menu, and offered a polite smile to the passing server. It was her first time dining at this establishment, a treat to herself after weeks of hard work. As she waited, she couldn't have imagined the storm that was about to brew. Peter Collins, the restaurant's manager, stood at the maitre d' station. A tall, thin man in his mid-40s with a perpetual smirk, Peter thrived on his perceived authority. His eyes scanned the room, lingering a beat longer on Mary. He leaned toward one of the waitstaff, whispering something that made the young server glance nervously at her table. "Why is she sitting there?" Peter muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, but vague enough to feign innocence. "She has a reservation," the server replied hesitantly, trying not to meet his gaze. Peter's tone sharpened. "Next time, check twice before seating someone who—" He cut himself off, but shot a pointed look at Mary before walking briskly toward her table. "Good evening," Peter said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I'm Peter Collins, the manager. I noticed you're seated at one of our more exclusive tables. May I ask if you're waiting for someone?" Mary raised an eyebrow. "No, I'm dining alone tonight. Is there a problem?" Peter's smirk widened, though it failed to reach his eyes. "Not a problem per se. It's just that this table is typically reserved for our VIP clientele. Perhaps I could relocate you to a more suitable spot." Mary set her menu down carefully, her expression calm but firm. "I made a reservation days ago, and this is the table I was assigned. I'm comfortable where I am." Peter hesitated, clearly not expecting pushback. "Of course, but we have a large party arriving shortly, and they specifically requested this section." Mary didn't flinch. "So you're asking me to move because someone else who hasn't arrived yet wants my table?" Peter's jaw tightened. "I assure you, ma'am, this is about ensuring all our guests have the best experience possible." Mary leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "I see. Tell me, Mr. Collins, do you often ask guests to give up their tables once they've been seated? Or is this a special courtesy reserved just for me?" The nearby tables fell silent, the tension palpable as diners strained to listen. Peter's composure cracked for a split second, and his eyes darted around the room. "There's no need to make this personal, ma'am." "It became personal the moment you approached me," Mary replied evenly. Just then, the restaurant's entrance swung open, and a tall, imposing figure walked in. Jason Daniels, Mary's son, entered wearing his police uniform. His commanding presence instantly drew attention, though he seemed unaware of the commotion. "Mum," Jason said warmly as he approached her table. He glanced briefly at Peter, then at Mary. "Am I late?" "Not at all," Mary replied, her calm demeanor now tinged with quiet amusement. "I was just having an interesting conversation with Mr. Collins here." Jason turned to Peter, his expression unreadable. "Is that right?" Peter, realizing too late the mistake he had made, stumbled over his words. I was just ensuring your mother's comfort. We're very particular about seating arrangements here." Jason's eyebrows lifted slightly, and he crossed his arms. "Funny, it didn't sound like that from what I heard. Care to explain?" The room, now entirely focused on the exchange, seemed to hold its collective breath. Peter's face turned an uncomfortable shade of red, and his once confident demeanor crumbled under Jason's piercing gaze. It was a misunderstanding," Peter stammered. Jason stepped closer, his tone calm but laced with authority. "Misunderstanding, huh? I think you owe my mother an apology, a real one." Peter swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize, ma'am. It won't happen again." Mary's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. She let the weight of the moment linger before nodding. "Thank you, I trust that it won't." Jason glanced around the room, addressing the diners who were now openly watching. "Respect is a basic courtesy, folks. It doesn't cost a thing, but it says a lot about who you are." The room remained silent as Peter quickly excused himself and retreated to the back of the restaurant. Jason sat across from his mother, his stern expression melting into a smile. "Are you okay?" "I am now," Mary replied, her tone light but steady. "Thank you, Jason." The tension began to dissipate as the diners returned to their meals, though the air remained charged. Jason's badge glinted under the soft chandelier light, a silent reminder to everyone present that justice always finds its way, even in the unlikeliest of places. A shift in focus. The incident at the restaurant, though seemingly resolved, left an indelible mark on the evening's ambiance. Peter Collins, now relegated to the back office, fumed quietly. His pride had been bruised and his frustration grew with every passing second. He paced the small room, muttering under his breath, occasionally glancing at the CCTV monitors displaying the restaurant's dining area. "Who does he think he is?" Peter hissed, his fists clenching. "Marching in here, showing me up in front of everyone." The staff avoided Peter for the remainder of the evening, acutely aware of his volatile mood. Meanwhile, Mary and Jason continued their meal, both pretending the earlier tension hadn't bothered them. Yet beneath Mary's composed exterior, a storm of emotions brewed. "Mom," Jason said softly, breaking the silence, "you didn't deserve that." Mary smiled faintly, her hands resting on the edges of her plate. "I've dealt with worse, Jason. You know that." "That doesn't make it right," Jason countered, his tone firm but gentle. "What he did wasn't just disrespectful, it was discriminatory." Mary tilted her head slightly, studying her son's face. "You've always been protective, but you don't need to fight every battle for me. I handled it." Jason leaned back, crossing his arms. "You shouldn't have to handle it. People like him count on us staying silent." Mary's gaze softened. "I didn't stay silent, did I?" Jason smiled despite himself. "No, you didn't." As they continued their meal, Peter re-emerged from the back, his expression carefully neutral, but his movements tense. He avoided Mary and Jason's table, focusing instead on checking on other diners, yet his discomfort was evident. Mary noticed his behavior but chose to ignore it, unwilling to let him ruin the rest of her evening. After their meal, Jason escorted Mary to her car. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere of the restaurant. As they reached her vehicle, Jason placed a hand on her shoulder. "If anything like this happens again, you call me immediately," he said. Mary chuckled softly. "You're always on duty, aren't you?" "Always," Jason replied, his tone unwavering. They exchanged a warm hug before parting ways. Jason watched as Mary drove off, his mind already racing with thoughts about the restaurant manager and the subtle injustices his mother had faced. Back inside the restaurant, Peter Collins remained restless. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts before dialing a number. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "What is it, Peter?" the voice asked impatiently. "I had a run-in tonight," Peter began, pacing again. "Some judge or lawyer or something. The guy was in a police uniform." "And?" the voice pressed. Peter hesitated. "And he made me look bad in front of the whole restaurant." His mother, some old black woman, was seated at one of the prime tables, and I tried to move her. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the voice replied, "You tried to move her? Are you out of your mind? You know how these things can escalate." Peter's frustration boiled over. "I didn't expect her son to show up, all right? I was just trying to keep the place running smoothly." The voice sighed. "Listen, Peter, you need to tread carefully. People are watching. One wrong move, and this could spiral." Peter rubbed his temples, his anger subsiding slightly. "I just don't like being made a fool of." Peter sat back in his chair, staring at the stack of invoices cluttering his desk. His mind wandered to his early days in the restaurant business, where every mistake felt like a threat to his future. He had worked his way up from busboy to manager, but the fear of losing it all never truly left him. "This isn't just about last night," Peter muttered to himself. "One bad review, one bad story, and it could all come crashing down." He clenched his fists, his frustration mingling with anxiety. He remembered the growing competition in the city's dining scene, the pressure to keep the restaurant's reputation spotless, and the subtle biases he had internalized over the years. "I can't let one incident ruin everything I've built." "Then don't act like one," the voice replied curtly before hanging up. Peter stared at his phone, his jaw tightening. The incident wasn't something he could let go of, but he also knew he had to tread carefully. His mind raced with ways to regain control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Jason returned to his apartment, his thoughts still on the evening's events. As he removed his uniform and prepared for bed, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from one of his colleagues at the precinct. "You good? Saw a post about you at that fancy restaurant." "What happened?" Jason frowned, quickly opening his social media app. A photo of him standing by his mother's table, arms crossed, was circulating online. The caption read, "When a racist manager messes with the wrong family. Justice served. La belle époque." The post had already garnered hundreds of likes and comments. Some praised Jason for standing up to Peter, while others criticized the situation as being blown out of proportion. Jason sighed, knowing this was only the beginning. He typed a quick reply to his colleague. "Yeah, I'm fine, just had to handle something." Jason set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. He knew the post would attract attention, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Peter Collins wasn't the type to let things slide quietly. The next day, word of the incident spread quickly. Regular patrons of La Belle Époque whispered about the confrontation, and some even called to express their displeasure with Peter's behavior. The restaurant owner, Charles Bennett, caught wind of the situation and scheduled a meeting with Peter. When Charles arrived, his usual calm demeanor was replaced by a stern expression. "Peter," he said, stepping into the office, "we need to talk." Peter stood from his desk, his face carefully composed. "Of course, Mr. Bennett. What's on your mind?" Charles closed the door behind him. "I've been getting calls, more than a few actually, about an incident last night involving you, a guest, and her son." Peter's composure faltered slightly. "I was just trying to maintain the restaurant's standards," he said defensively. "By asking a paying customer to move tables?" Charles pressed. "A customer who had a reservation?" Peter hesitated. "It was a misunderstanding." Charles folded his arms. "I hope so, because this kind of behavior reflects poorly on all of us. I can't afford to have this place associated with discrimination or disrespect." "It won't happen again," Peter promised, though his tone lacked conviction. "It had better not," Charles replied firmly. "For now, I'll be monitoring things more closely. If I hear another complaint, there will be consequences." Peter nodded, though his mind was already spinning. He wasn't about to let this incident define him or his career. The fallout begins. Peter Collins spent the rest of the day fuming, though he did his best to maintain a professional front. The restaurant buzzed with its usual lunch hour rush, but the whispers among staff and patrons were impossible to ignore. Every side glance felt like an accusation, every hushed conversation like an indictment of his actions. Meanwhile, Jason couldn't shake the viral post. By mid-afternoon, it had been picked up by local news outlets, accompanied by articles recounting the altercation at La Belle Époque. Some reporters attempted to contact Jason directly, but he ignored their calls, knowing any response could escalate the situation. However, the story wasn't going away. Inside a bustling newsroom, journalist Carla Reynolds scrolled through the post with keen interest. Known for her hard-hitting exposés, Carla recognized the potential for a much bigger story beneath the surface. She quickly made a call to her editor. "This restaurant incident with the cop and his mum, there's more to it," Carla said, already jotting notes. "I want to dig into the manager's background, the restaurant's history, and whether this is part of a pattern." Her editor's voice crackled through the line. "You think there's enough there?" "I do," Carla replied firmly. "And if there is, this could be explosive." At the precinct, Jason was called into his captain's office. Captain Lila Morgan, a no-nonsense leader with a reputation for fairness, gestured for Jason to sit. "I'm sure you know why you're here," Morgan began, holding up her phone to show the viral post. "Yes, ma'am," Jason replied. "I've seen it." Morgan set the phone down. "Look, I'm not here to reprimand you. From what I've read, you handled yourself appropriately. But this kind of attention can complicate things, for you, for us, and for your family." Jason nodded, appreciating her candor. "I understand, Captain. I didn't ask for this, but I also couldn't just stand by." Morgan leaned back, studying him. "You did the right thing, Jason, but be prepared. Things like this have a way of snowballing. Keep your head down and stay professional. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Jason said, his voice steady. As he left the office, Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. The viral post had sparked something bigger than he anticipated, and the ripple effects were only beginning. Back at La Belle Époque, Peter received a surprise visitor. Carla Reynolds strolled into the restaurant, her confident demeanor turning heads as she approached the front desk. "I'm here to speak with Peter Collins," she said, flashing her press badge. The hostess hesitated. "Mr. Collins is very busy right now. Can I take a message?" Carla smiled faintly. "Tell him it's regarding the incident that's all over the news. I'll wait." The hostess, flustered, disappeared into the back. Moments later, Peter emerged, his expression tight. "Mr. Collins," Carla said, extending her hand. "Carla Reynolds with the Tribune. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened here 2 nights ago." Peter shook her hand reluctantly, his mind racing. "I'm not sure there's much to talk about. It was a misunderstanding." "Misunderstandings don't usually go viral," Carla countered. "Would you care to elaborate on what happened?" Peter forced a smile. "I'm afraid I can't comment on private matters involving our guests. If you'd like to speak to someone, I suggest contacting our corporate office." Carla raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You're welcome to give a canned response, but the public is going to want answers. And if there's a pattern of behavior here, that's a story I intend to tell." Peter's expression darkened. "There's no pattern, Ms. Reynolds, just a single incident that's been blown out of proportion." "Time will tell," Carla said, scribbling in her notebook. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." As she left, Peter clenched his fists at his sides. He felt the walls closing in, and for the first time, he wondered if this situation might spiral out of his control. That evening, Jason visited his mother at her modest home. Mary greeted him with a warm hug and ushered him into the living room. "You've been quiet today," Mary said, handing Jason a cup of tea. "Everything all right?" Jason hesitated, debating how much to share. "The post about what happened has gone viral, Mum. It's in the news now." Mary sighed, her expression thoughtful. "I figured it might. People don't let things like this stay quiet anymore. I just don't want it to bring trouble to you," Jason said. Vanessa paused for a moment, her expression distant as if lost in thought. "You know, Jason," she began, her voice tinged with emotion. "For so long, I thought this was just how things would always be, that no matter how much we tried, nothing would change." Jason looked at her, puzzled. "But something did change today, Mum. People are seeing it. They're talking about it." "Exactly," Vanessa replied, her voice gaining strength. "And maybe it's time we did more than just let ourselves be heard. Maybe it's time to show that stories like ours can be the start of real change." Jason nodded slowly, understanding where she was headed. "You're ready to take this further, aren't you? To be part of something bigger?" "I am," Vanessa said firmly. "If not us, then who?" Jason smiled. "Then let's do it together. Where do we start?" Mary placed a reassuring hand on his. "Jason, I've faced more trouble than this in my lifetime. If anything, this could shine a light on something that needs to be addressed." Jason nodded, though he still felt uneasy. "Just promise me you'll call if anything happens." "I will," Mary said with a smile. "Now stop worrying. You've done enough." Late that night, Carla began piecing together her article. She discovered that La Belle Époque had received multiple complaints in the past alleging discriminatory practices, though none had gained traction. She also found a pattern of similar incidents involving Peter Collins at his previous place of employment. "This guy's got a history," Carla muttered to herself, typing furiously, "and this time, he's not getting away with it." The turning point. The restaurant buzzed with quiet intensity as a new wave of diners settled into their tables. Unbeknownst to the manager, Jason remained seated in a corner, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. With his police badge tucked discreetly in his jacket pocket, he knew it wasn't time to reveal his hand. Not yet. Meanwhile, Vanessa tried to steady herself. Her initial shock was giving way to determination. She wasn't one to let ignorance and prejudice slide without consequence. After finishing her water, she took a deep breath and called the manager back to her table. "Yes?" the manager said, his voice clipped and impatient, as if speaking to her was an inconvenience. "I'd like to speak with the owner," Vanessa said firmly. The manager chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "And why would that be necessary?" Vanessa didn't flinch. "I think the owner should hear how their customers are being treated, especially since this isn't the first time I've been here and never encountered such behavior." The mention of her being a repeat customer momentarily threw the manager off balance. He glanced at her outfit, then back at her composed demeanor, and something flickered in his expression. Perhaps doubt, perhaps annoyance. "The owner is not available," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But if you'd like, you can leave your comments at the front desk." Vanessa wasn't buying it. "Then perhaps I'll make a call," she said, pulling her phone from her purse. Jason watched from his table, his fists clenched under the surface of his cool exterior. As a police officer, he'd seen countless situations where authority figures abused their power, but seeing his mother subjected to such humiliation was a level of personal that he hadn't prepared for. The manager noticed Vanessa dialing and narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop creating a disturbance. If you can't comply, I will have to ask you to leave." Jason couldn't sit idle any longer. He rose from his chair, his imposing presence cutting through the tension in the room. "And what exactly constitutes a disturbance here?" he said, his voice calm, but laced with an undertone that demanded attention. The manager froze, startled by Jason's sudden interjection. "Excuse me, sir, this doesn't concern you." "It absolutely does," Jason replied, stepping closer. "When you humiliate someone without cause and disrupt their evening, you create a situation that involves everyone here." The diners nearby began murmuring, their attention now fully captured by the unfolding drama. The manager's confidence began to falter, but he clung to his arrogance. "I don't appreciate your tone, sir. This is a private establishment, and I have the right to maintain order." Jason's jaw tightened. "And I have the right to make sure people like you don't get away with abusing your position." The manager's face turned a deep shade of red. "Sir, if you don't leave immediately, I will have no choice but to call the authorities." Jason reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge and holding it up for all to see. The murmurs around the room grew louder. "No need to call them. I'm already here." The color drained from the manager's face. Vanessa's lips curled into a subtle but triumphant smile as Jason continued, his voice steady and commanding. "Now why don't we all take a moment to address what's really happening here?" The manager stammered, his bravado evaporating. I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just following policy." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Policy? Tell me, does this policy apply to everyone equally or just to people you decide don't fit the image of this restaurant?" The room was dead silent, all eyes on the unfolding confrontation. Jason took a step closer, lowering his voice but making it even more authoritative. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get the owner on the phone, right now, and you're going to explain to them exactly what you've done here tonight." The manager hesitated, looking around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The crowd was against him, and Jason's unwavering stance made it clear there would be no easy way out. Vanessa placed her phone on the table and folded her hands calmly. "I'd like to hear what the owner has to say." The manager, now visibly sweating, nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Let me make the call." He hurried off toward the kitchen, his composure in tatters. Jason turned to Vanessa, his expression softening. "You okay, Mom?" She nodded, her eyes shimmering with pride and relief. "I am now. Thank you." As the murmurs in the room began to subside, Jason pulled out a chair and sat beside her, his presence a shield of strength. Whatever happened next, they were ready to face it together. A call for accountability. The manager disappeared behind the kitchen doors, leaving the dining area in hushed anticipation. All eyes remained fixed on Vanessa and Jason, their quiet composure striking a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Jason leaned toward Vanessa, his voice low but firm. "He'll try to spin this, Mom. Stay calm, we've got the upper hand." Vanessa nodded, her resolve strengthening. The humiliation she had endured was now a source of fuel. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for everyone who had been mistreated in silence. Minutes later, the manager returned, his posture stiff and his phone pressed tightly against his ear. His expression was a mix of dread and desperation. He glanced at Jason and Vanessa before holding the phone out toward her. "The owner would like to speak with you," he said, his voice strained. Vanessa took the phone, her hands steady. "Hello, this is Vanessa. Who am I speaking with?" The voice on the other end introduced itself as Mr. Reynolds, the restaurant's owner. His tone was polite, even apologetic, though it carried the weight of someone accustomed to diffusing situations. "Ms. Vanessa," Reynolds began, "I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding or offense caused tonight. I assure you, this is not how we conduct business." Vanessa's grip on the phone tightened. "With all due respect, Mr. Reynolds, what happened tonight was more than a misunderstanding. Your manager went out of his way to target and humiliate me without cause. I need to know if this behavior aligns with your values or if it's a reflection of your training policies." Reynolds hesitated before responding. "Of course it doesn't align with our values. I'll be addressing this matter immediately. Please allow me to make this right." Jason, sitting beside her, leaned in and whispered, "Put him on speaker." Vanessa did so, her voice unwavering. "You're on speaker now, Mr. Reynolds. My son is here, and I think it's important you know who he is." Jason's voice carried across the line. "Officer Jason Carter, sir. And what your manager displayed tonight wasn't just poor judgment. It was blatant discrimination. I need to know what steps you'll take to ensure this doesn't happen again." The restaurant was silent, diners straining to hear every word. Reynolds exhaled audibly on the other end. "Officer Carter, thank you for your candor. I promise you this will be handled. I value all of my patrons and will ensure our staff undergoes immediate retraining to prevent incidents like this from recurring." Jason exchanged a glance with Vanessa before replying. "A promise is only as good as the action that follows. We'll be following up to ensure accountability." Reynolds' tone softened, though the tension in his voice was palpable. "Understood. Please, allow me to invite you both back as my personal guests. I'd like to make amends." Vanessa handed the phone back to the manager without another word, her dignity intact. The manager stood there awkwardly, unsure how to proceed. Jason addressed him directly, his voice firm but calm. "You're on notice. You can choose to learn from this or you can let it define you. The choice is yours." The manager nodded stiffly, his arrogance now replaced with humility. "Understood, sir." As Jason and Vanessa prepared to leave, applause erupted from the nearby tables. Diners who had witnessed the confrontation clapped and cheered, their support echoing through the restaurant. Vanessa smiled softly, glancing at Jason. "Shayu stood by me tonight, I'll never forget that." Jason placed a hand on her shoulder. "Always, Mom. Always." The two walked out of the restaurant, heads held high, leaving behind a room filled with reflection and a manager who had learned a powerful lesson. The ripple effect. The night's events spread like wildfire, both online and offline. By the time Vanessa and Jason reached home, social media was already buzzing. Several diners had recorded the confrontation on their phones, and the footage had been uploaded with captions like, "Black woman harassed by racist manager until her police officer son steps in. This mother-son duo stands up against discrimination." Jason scrolled through his phone, his brow furrowed. "It's everywhere, Mom. People are talking about it." Vanessa sipped her tea, her face calm but thoughtful. Good. Let them talk. Maybe this will wake a few people up. The video had sparked a wave of outrage. Comments flooded the posts. Why does this still happen in 2025? This manager should be fired immediately. Kudos to the officer for handling it with such professionalism. Jason looked up from his phone. Mum, people are calling for the manager to be fired. They're tagging the restaurant's social media accounts. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Do you think that will actually happen? Jason shrugged. Depends on the owner, but public pressure works wonders. By morning, the story had hit the local news. Reporters stood outside the restaurant, interviewing patrons and activists who had gathered to protest. Signs reading, "No room for racism" and "Justice for Vanessa" dotted the crowd. Inside the restaurant, the manager, now visibly stressed, watched the news coverage on a small TV in the break room. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from the owner and concerned staff. The restaurant issued a public statement. We deeply regret the incident that occurred last night at our establishment. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The manager involved has been placed on administrative leave pending a thorough investigation. Our sincerest apologies to Ms. Vanessa and her family. Jason read the statement aloud to Vanessa. They're trying to save face. Vanessa chuckled. Typical corporate talk. Let's see if they follow through with actual action. Meanwhile, the video had reached the desk of the city's police chief, who immediately called Jason into his office. Officer Carter, the chief began, his tone serious but measured. I saw the footage from last night. You handled yourself well. Thank you, sir, Jason replied. The chief leaned forward. I want you to know, this department stands behind you and your mother, but I also think this is an opportunity to lead by example. Would you consider speaking at a community forum about what happened? Jason hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his forte, but he recognized the importance of the moment. If it helps push for change, I'll do it. The chief nodded. Good. Let me know how we can support you. That evening, Vanessa and Jason sat at the dining table preparing for the forum. Jason jotted down notes while Vanessa reflected on her own words. Mum, Jason began, what you said last night, it was powerful. People are paying attention because of you. Vanessa smiled softly. They're paying attention because of us, Jason. We showed them what accountability looks like. The community forum was held at a local center, packed with attendees from all walks of life. Vanessa and Jason sat on the stage, alongside activists and community leaders. When it was her turn to speak, Vanessa approached the microphone, her voice steady and resonant. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, she began. It's part of a pattern that too many of us have faced. But last night I learned something. Standing up isn't just about defending yourself, it's about inspiring others to do the same. The crowd erupted in applause. Jason followed, speaking about the role of law enforcement in combating bias and standing with the community. Accountability starts with us, he said. If we don't stand up, who will? The forum became a rallying cry for change, and by the end of the night, Vanessa and Jason were approached by local organizers who wanted to collaborate on future initiatives. As they drove home, Jason turned to Vanessa. Mom, I think this is just the beginning. Vanessa nodded. Then let's make sure we finish what we've started. Change in motion. The morning after the forum, Vanessa woke to find her phone flooded with messages. Friends, family, and even strangers had reached out to show their support. One message stood out, a personal note from the restaurant's owner. Ms. Carter, I am deeply ashamed of what occurred in my establishment. I would like to meet with you and your son to discuss how we can make amends and ensure this never happens again. Please let me know if you're willing. Vanessa read the message twice, her emotions mixed. While she appreciated the gesture, she wasn't sure if it was genuine or just damage control. What do you think, Jason? She asked, handing him the phone. Jason skimmed the message and nodded thoughtfully. I think you should hear them out. If they're serious about making changes, it could set an example for other businesses. Vanessa agreed to the meeting, and the owner arranged for it to take place at a neutral location. When they arrived at the community center, the owner greeted them nervously. He was an older man with kind eyes, but a demeanor weighed down by guilt. Ms. Carter, Officer Carter, thank you for agreeing to meet with me, he began. I want to start by apologizing. Not just for what happened, but for allowing an environment where it could happen at all. Vanessa crossed her arms, her expression neutral. What do you plan to do about it? The owner took a deep breath. The manager involved has been terminated, effective immediately, but I know that's not enough. I've already reached out to diversity and inclusion experts to conduct mandatory training for my entire staff. Additionally, I want to work with local organizations to ensure our restaurant becomes a welcoming space for everyone. Vanessa studied him for a moment. And how do I know this isn't just about saving your business? It's not, the owner said earnestly. I realize now that I've been complacent. I need to do better, and I want your input on how we can rebuild trust with the community. Jason chimed in. Actions speak louder than words. If you follow through on what you've said, people will notice. The owner nodded. Thank you. I'll make sure my actions match my words. As they left the meeting, Vanessa felt a small sense of satisfaction. While the owner's promises wouldn't erase what happened, they were a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, the incident continued to gain traction. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of both the challenges of systemic racism and the power of accountability. Jason's police department also received praise for his professionalism, with the chief issuing a statement. Officer Carter exemplifies the values we strive for in our department. His actions remind us that law enforcement must stand with the communities we serve, not against them. The department's social media accounts shared the story, sparking conversations about the role of police in addressing bias. Jason, however, was less focused on the attention and more on the opportunities it created. He began working with local schools and community groups to host workshops on building trust between law enforcement and the community. "Mom," he said one evening as they prepared for another event, "I never thought this would turn into something so big." Vanessa smiled. That's what happens when you stand up for what's right. It creates ripples. At the same time, the restaurant began implementing the changes the owner had promised. Social media posts documented the diversity training sessions, partnerships with community organizations, and initiatives to support underprivileged groups. One post featured a heartfelt message from the new manager. "Our restaurant is committed to rebuilding trust with the community. We stand against discrimination and are dedicated to being a place where everyone feels welcome." Vanessa saw the post and felt a flicker of hope. While she knew change wouldn't happen overnight, it was clear that her actions had made an impact. The weeks turned into months, and Vanessa and Jason's story continued to inspire others. Activists and community leaders referenced their actions as a blueprint for addressing discrimination. During a televised interview, Vanessa was asked, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned from this experience?" She paused before replying, "That standing up for yourself isn't just about protecting your dignity. It's about creating space for others to do the same. Change starts with courage, and courage is contagious." The interviewer smiled. "And what would you say to someone facing a similar situation?" "Don't be afraid to speak up," Vanessa said firmly. "You have more power than you realize." A legacy of change. Months after the incident that sparked national conversation, Vanessa and Jason stood together in the community park where it all began. A celebration was underway, organized by local leaders to honor their courage and to mark the progress made since that fateful day. The park buzzed with life. Families gathered under colorful tents, children played on the grass, and a stage at the center drew a growing crowd. Banners with messages like "Justice for All" and "Stand Together, Change Together" adorned the event. As Vanessa walked through the crowd, people stopped to thank her. Strangers who had been inspired by her bravery shared how her story had given them the courage to stand up in their own lives. Jason, now recognized as a leader within his department, had expanded his outreach efforts. He collaborated with local activists to create ongoing programs fostering trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. The highlight of the evening was Vanessa's speech. When she stepped onto the stage, applause erupted. She looked out at the crowd, taking a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "When I walked into that restaurant months ago, I never imagined we'd end up here. What started as a moment of humiliation has become a movement for change. The audience listened intently as Vanessa continued. I've learned that when we stand up for ourselves, we're not just protecting our dignity, we're lighting a path for others. That day I didn't know my son was watching, but I'm proud to say that his courage has matched mine every step of the way. She gestured toward Jason, who stood in the crowd, receiving another round of applause. This fight isn't over, Vanessa said. We've made progress, but there's more work to do. The changes we've seen, the training at the restaurant, the programs in the community, the conversations sparked across the nation, are proof that change is possible when we come together. Her voice grew stronger. To everyone here tonight, and to everyone watching this story unfold, know that your voice matters, your actions matter, and together, we can create a world where no one has to endure what I did. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy filling the evening air. As the event wound down, Vanessa and Jason recorded a short message for those who couldn't be there in person. Standing side by side, Vanessa spoke directly to the camera. To everyone who followed our journey, thank you, she said. Your support has meant the world to us. But we're not done yet. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. Jason added, if this story inspired you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and leave a comment below about how you're making a difference in your community. We want to hear your stories. Vanessa nodded. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll continue to shine a light on stories that matter, to inspire action, and to create the change we all deserve. As the video ended, Vanessa and Jason stood in the park, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a perfect backdrop for the sense of hope they carried. This is just the beginning, Vanessa said softly. Jason smiled. And we're ready for whatever comes next. The screen faded to black, but their voices echoed one last time. Together we can change the world. To everyone who made it to the end of this story, thank you. Your engagement makes a difference. If this story moved you, like the video to show your support. Share it to inspire someone else. And subscribe to join our growing community of changemakers. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're from. We love hearing from you. Together, we can create a brighter future. Let's keep going.